Good morning, everybody. My cat says good morning too. Okay, so today we are taking up Gate 58 of the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. And today's gate statement says, the faculty of belief is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we do not blindly follow the words of others. So you'll recall from last time and previous talks that we are in the middle of a section of this 108 gates that is describing the constituent factors of Bodhi, or awakening. So in the early teachings, again, these were kind of linear steps on an extended path of deepening practice toward reaching nirvana and leaping off the wheel. So there were 37 factors in 7 categories. And so these gate statements are kind of going down the list. So we've looked at the 4 foundations of mindfulness. We've looked at the 4 exertions or the 4 restraints. Last time we talked about the 4 bases of spiritual power, and now we're turning to the 5 faculties that lead to liberation. So each of these faculties isn't really new. We've encountered them elsewhere in the 108 gates, so we've talked about them before, but one thing that's important here is how they begin to fit together, with each other and with other teachings. And so we'll start to see connections now with, some other things that are going on in the tradition. So the early teachings say that if a bodhisattva acquires these 5 faculties, that he or she will be able to believe in the true nature of the Dharma. So each of these 5 faculties leads to the next one. So belief or faith leads to energy, which leads to mindfulness, to concentration, and to wisdom. So those are the 5. The 5 that eventually we'll be looking at. So that should seem like a familiar grouping, right? Because it's the samadhi section of the Eightfold Path, right? Right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. All of these are they fall within that section. So today we are starting with the faculty of belief, which is sometimes translated as faith or conviction. So that kind of grouping of ideas. The theme that runs through teachings about faith or belief from the Buddha right up through Uchiyama Roshi is that it is difficult for us as deluded human beings to see what Buddha saw, right? I mean, it's not easy. In some ways, it's difficult for us to understand the true nature of Zazen. It's difficult for us to put aside our filters and our preconceptions and be in touch with the Dharma in a really deep way. This is not easy. We don't get it the first time we sit down, the first time we pick up a book on the Dharma, the first time we walk into a Dharma center, we don't get it right away. So we need to have some faith that what Buddha awakened to is real, that it is, the reality, and that we can experience that and touch that for ourselves in our practice. I think for us also, we need some faith that Zazen is a complete expression of that awakening, that what we're doing is meaningful. Sitting on the cushion, looking at a wall for 50 minutes at a time, right? We need some faith that what we're doing, makes some sense. So faith or conviction is more than just accepting a set of beliefs that somebody hands us. Teachers do a lot of talking, and there are lots of books on the Dharma, but this is not about just sort of encountering something and then just sort of blindly accepting it. So there are said to be 4 elements of conviction. But there are, of course, 2 different sets of 4 elements of conviction, depending on what you're looking at and where you are. One has to do with how we cultivate this conviction or belief. The other has to do with what we actually believe in. And both of these things are helpful. And that's not the only set of 4 we're going to run into today. So, things are nicely grouped so that we can remember what they are, and we have multiple groups of 4 today. So this first set of factors includes intellectual elements, volitional elements, emotional, and social. And we'll talk about each of those 4, right? So intellectual, simply what we believe, right? We're going along with teachings that might not immediately appear to have some basis in fact or evidence. Our experience up until we meet the Dharma is based on our preconceptions and our stories. So, we might think, well, there's there's not a lot of evidence for what Buddha is teaching here. Our usual thinking, our usual experience lead us to conclude that reality is not the same as what Buddha says it is, because our experience of reality might be something else. So our thinking minds might be unaware of the teachings. We might have, doubts about the teachings. Maybe we're aware of them, but we haven't really bought in yet. There's some doubt there. So it only works initially if we have some trust. in teachers or scriptures or Sangha friends or something. Something got us in the door of a Dharma center. Something got us onto the cushion for the first time. Some awakening of trust was happening there. That what was, that this practice was a wholesome thing. So once we have some actual experience of practice and maybe some beginnings of insight, then we verify for ourselves that these teachings are true, that they truly do reflect reality, that we can practice with these things and see what Buddha saw. So that's the intellectual piece. The volitional piece, it means that we have the will and we have the courage to step forward and actually practice. So beyond listening to what someone says or reading something in a book, we have the courage to sit down and try it out, and we have the will to go forward into our practice. So there's an element of steadfastness there, or resolution, and also some self-confidence that we can actually do this crazy practice, that it is possible for us to sit on a cushion for 30 minutes or 50 minutes or something facing a wall, and that's a meaningful thing to do, that somehow awakening is there. So we put aside our fears and our waverings and maybe our skepticism and the need to get some immediate payback out of our practice, because that's a verification for us, right? Usually it's like I do something and there's a result, and I think it's a good result, and therefore I go on. Well, we all know our practice is like water dripping on a stone, right? So we don't get this immediate payback. So, maybe it's hard to have some faith in that. Maybe we have some doubts around that. So that's the volitional piece. We simply have the will, the courage to step forward, to keep going in our practice. The third piece here is the emotional piece. So we let go of worries, anxieties. We have some sense of peace and some sense of clarity. Someone who has faith is said to lose the 5 terrors, right? So being worried about having the necessities of life, being worried about death, being worried about loss of reputation, being worried about an unhappy rebirth, and being worried about the impression we make on an audience. Those are the 5 terrors. These are the things we are afraid of. And when we practice, we get to sort of put those things aside. And emotionally, we don't suppress them, we don't ignore them, but maybe they kind of loosen their grip on us a little bit. So that all makes sense when we come to understand no self, or emptiness, right? We have less to do to manage our egos, to manage our self-image. I am less concerned about the impression that I'm making on you today. Although, right? So that's the emotional piece. Finally, we have the social piece. And really, this is about who do we trust? There's a turn from reliance on public opinion, or what Sawaki Roshi called group stupidity, perhaps, to faith in the 3 treasures. So who are we looking to as examples, as practice supports, as wise friends? For monks in early Buddhism, they really did leave society. So when we're talking about who do we trust, they were giving up family and social roles and all those other things, and really making a big shift toward, what were they looking to? They were looking to the 3 treasures. So we don't leave society in that same way, right? We're very much still in the midst of the happenings of the world. We're living with our families, we're holding down jobs, we're out in the community, but we still make a shift away from social influences that may not be so wholesome. We start to look a little bit more critically at what are we exposing ourselves to? What are we hanging out in? What's the soup we're hanging out in? And is it wholesome? Is it providing support for my practice? Is it pulling me off track? We choose to spend time in the Sangha with other people who practice, because that is a helpful, means of support, where our practice is being reflected back to us. Our practice is reinforced by other people who are trying to live in Buddha's way. So that doesn't mean we give up other relationships. It doesn't mean we turn our backs on, right, the rest of the world, but we try to see them clearly, and we make some choice about what we go along with. Who are we listening to and what are we going along with? So there's an image in our practice, of our place in Buddha's family. So Buddha is the father, and Prajnaparamita is the mother, and the Sangha are the brothers and sisters. So this is our practice family, right? This is our Dharma family. So socially, we have a place, right? We fit in, which is helpful, I think, comforting. So those are the four elements, that first grouping, right? So we have intellectual, we have volitional, we have emotional, we have social. That brings us to the question of what is it that we actually have faith in, right? So there are four things in which we are said to have faith. One is karma and rebirth, or I would call that cause and effect, because this is a very early teaching, so we can interpret that in whatever way, makes sense for us. Cause and effect, right? Something happens and something else happens. We do something, there's some effect. Second one is, we have faith in the basic teachings about the nature of reality. Well, that means no self. That means emptiness. That means dependent origination. Those are things which are not immediately obvious, and yet somehow we have faith in these things. Third thing is the three treasures. We throw ourselves into the house of Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. We have faith in the three treasures. The fourth is that we have faith in the practice itself as a means of liberating ourselves and other beings from suffering, right? So those four things. So Buddha says, believing in this practice, following in this way, he says following any other way, any other practice would be like trying to squeeze sesame oil out of gravel or trying to churn butter out of water. So those things just do not make sense. This is the path for liberating ourselves and others from suffering. So belief is what provides the inspiration and the aspiration, if you will. It helps us resolve doubt. It helps us stick to the path, stick to the practice. Taking refuge in the three treasures is one of the most basic things we do in this practice. We know when we take precepts, and even before we take precepts, we are really taking refuge in, turning toward, believing in three treasures. So without making some commitment based on faith, it's really not possible for us to practice in this tradition. Somehow we suspended our disbelief when we began to practice, and we said, there's something here. So when we start to practice, that's sometimes called entering the stream. There was one of the early books I read was called, entering the stream. So we have this metaphor about entering the stream when we begin to practice in this Buddhist tradition. So the early texts say that it is this stream entry where we really see this faculty of belief that this gate statement starts to talk about. It is when we begin to practice that we really see these elements working, right? We really see these elements in motion. And guess what? There are another four factors, four factors of stream entry. So as we're entering the stream or before we enter the stream, as we're making that commitment, getting started, association with good people, listening to the true Dharma, paying appropriate attention, and practicing in accordance with the Dharma. So those four things are critical to us as we get started in practice. And I would say, of course, as we continue to practice. So once we enter the stream, then our faith in these three treasures is awakened and also supported. So the more we do this, the more we verify, right? The stronger our conviction becomes, the stronger our belief becomes. So the Veda Sutta says, a person is endowed with verified confidence in the awakened one. Indeed, the Blessed One is worthy and rightly self-awakened, consummate in knowledge and conduct, well gone, an expert with regard to the world, unexcelled as a trainer for those people fit to be tamed, the teacher of divine and human beings, awakened and blessed. That's the Buddha piece. So this is going to talk about the stream entry, the person doing the stream entry, and his or her encountering, right, experience with these three things. So that's Buddha. He's awakened with verified confidence in the Dharma. The Dharma is well expounded by the Blessed One to be seen here and now, timeless, inviting verification, pertinent to be realized by the wise for themselves. He is endowed with verified confidence in the Sangha of the Blessed One's disciples who have practiced well, who have practiced straightforwardly, who have practiced methodically, who have practiced masterfully. In other words, the Sangha of the Blessed One's disciples is worthy of gifts, worthy of hospitality, worthy of offerings, worthy of respect, the incomparable field of merit for the world. So we enter the stream, we encounter the three treasures, and we verify that these things are meaningful, these things are worthy. So we can start to see how some of these elements are coming together, right? Trust in wise people, that they know what practice is about and how to do it, belief in what the Buddha and ancestors and teachers are teaching us, telling us, and willingness to make the leap and actually put the teachings into practice, right? To step forward and practice with body and mind. So if we believe in Buddha's awakening, we eventually come to see how delusion arises, how suffering arises, how that whole dynamic works. We see how cause and effect work. We see how central cause and effect are to our practice. And we see that we can take real steps to deal with our suffering. So, our suffering is not visited upon us from somewhere outside, and we're not kind of helpless in the grip of this thing. That, there is a way to understand suffering, how suffering arises, and what we can do to liberate ourselves and all beings. So it can be difficult to accept that we can use our karmic conditions to transcend our karmic conditions, if you will. We in the beginning, or even as we go along, kind of feel we're in the grip of our karmic conditions. I'm in the middle of this circumstance. I'm in the middle of this, situation. I feel stuck. This can't possibly be nirvana. Like, what? This can't possibly be true. So somehow, we get to see we can use our karmic conditions to transcend our karmic conditions. So, we may feel pretty limited. We may feel pretty ignorant. We may fall prey to the hindrances that go with being in this human form. But we also know that our karmic conditions are the ground of our practice. There's nowhere else to go. This is this is what we're working with. We don't have any other choice. So this body and mind, this moment right now, these circumstances right now are the ground of our practice. So, there's no need to escape from that. But that's not easy to see in the beginning. We would like to think there's some perfect circumstance, and I'm headed toward that. And when I get there, that'll be the time to practice, or that'll be the time that awakening shows up, or, something magical will happen. So, the teachings in our tradition about samsara and nirvana are both right here can be a little bit difficult to accept because, golly, I'm having pain in the circumstance I'm in. This can't possibly be nirvana. So there's some necessary faith there, The second half of the gate statement says we do not blindly follow the words of others. And that's a whole interesting thing. So faith and the actual activity of our practice are not actually separate. We can't actually separate faith from practice activity. We need some level of trust to begin practicing, and we need personal experience of practice in order to strengthen our conviction and to stay on this path. So these things really are not separate. They really work together. Once we have that conviction, we've put our toe in the water, we've stepped into the stream, we've begun to practice, we've built up some belief or some faith. At that point, we can stop sort of blindly wandering around, trying to, looking for this spiritual technique and that teaching and this practice over here, right? We can stop doing that because we can see that we're on a path which is wholesome and meaningful. So, one important element of faith is the belief that everything we need to liberate ourselves and all beings is within this practice. It's within what Buddha taught. So we don't need to go kind of wandering around anymore, looking for various kind of spiritual technologies or, various picking and choosing out of various other traditions. We may choose to do that. We might decide that that's helpful somehow. But when we look carefully, we see that, everything we need for liberation is available to us within this practice. So it's another aspect, I think, of nothing extra. And we've certainly talked about nothing extra here. Our practice is about not adding things in. So our practice of Zazen, again, there's only 4 things we do. In our Zazen practice, we take the posture, we keep the eyes open, we breathe softly through the nose, and we open the hand of thought. Anything else we say is extra. If we're introducing other activities, other kind of mental whatever going on, we say, well, that's extra. So we can have some faith that what we're practicing is enough. And we don't need to add something which is extra. And the other side of that, of course, is that there's nothing in the teachings and practice that we can ignore. If this is a complete system or a complete thing, right? Not only do we not need to add extra, there's also nothing about this practice we can really ignore. So we can't, for instance, really separate the 3 categories of the Eightfold Path. If we are sitting Zazen, trying to sit Zazen, and we're ignoring, say the ethical element of the Eightfold Path, we're out there trying to cultivate wisdom and sit Zazen and be concentrated, somehow, that's not going to work. We're never going to settle down in Zazen unless we pay attention to, all the sections of the Eightfold Path. So teaching and practice are both complete in themselves with nothing extra and nothing lacking, right? But it's difficult to see that immediately. So, accepting that takes a certain amount of faith. So this is really not about intellectually accepting various ideas. If spiritual activity is only in our minds, then it's pretty hard to stick with it because we're not really living it from here, moment by moment by moment. It's something we're carrying around in our heads. Maybe someday I will learn to sit zazen. Right now, I'm reading a lot of Dharma or something, right? So it's like until we actually put this thing into practice, it's difficult to stick with it because we're not like, it's, not part of body and mind. Okay, so there's a certain amount of faith element there. Sometimes teaching and practice, we know, are a challenge to our ego, to our self-image, to our stories about the world, our various perceptions of how things work. It's one of the first things we encounter in practice, right? It's a real test of faith to practice according to the Dharma and to really set aside all our preconceptions and our, ideas and the things that we're carrying around. So, it's much easier to sort of pick and choose the parts of the practice and the parts of the teaching that match what we already think we know, or that match the experience we already have, match our own ideas. But, Buddha's teachings are an elegant system and all the elements are interconnected. So they support each other. They reinforce each other. They support us in moving toward liberation from suffering. So let's see how our more immediate ancestors talk about conviction or faith or belief. Now that we have some understanding of what that meant in the early days, let's move forward a few years. So Dogen Zenji wrote about this quite a bit. He wrote a lot about faith and conviction. Among other things, he wrote an entire fascicle, the Shobogenzo, on having faith in the three treasures. Kie Buku Soho is all about faith. So clearly he saw it as an important part of our practice. And he even included it when he wrote his personal vow about practice. So part of that vow says, along with all living beings, I wish from this lifetime through many lifetimes to hear the true Dharma. When I hear it, I will not doubt the true Dharma. I will not lack faith. When I encounter the true Dharma, I will discard mundane principles and accept and maintain the Buddha Dharma. Finally, I will complete the way together with the great earth and all living beings. So faith is right there in his personal practice vow. So he also wrote in the Gakudo Yojinshu, practitioners of the way must first of all have faith in the way. Those who have faith in the Buddha way must believe that one is within the way from the beginning, that one is free from delusive desires, upside-down ways of seeing things, excesses or deficiencies, and mistakes. So Hojo-san's comment about that piece of text is this. This is the basis of our practice. Although we are already in the way, we are deluded and miss the way. It is strange, but that is reality. We are in the way from the beginningless beginning, and yet we are deluded human beings to the endless end. So our practice, our vow is endless. And if we practice in that way, then each activity, each practice, moment by moment, is the perfect manifestation of the Buddha way. So again, we see that faith and belief are really central to our practice. Hojo-san calls it the basis. This is the basis of our practice. So it's difficult to accept that in spite of our delusions and our misunderstandings, awakening is somehow already here. We're already right in the middle of the Buddha way. We're not outside of it. We don't need some kind of special permission to enter into it. We don't need to achieve something to enter into it. Somehow, awakening is right here, and we're already in the middle of Buddha's path. So Dogen says in the Bendo-wa, on the whole, the Buddha realm is incomprehensible, unreachable through discrimination, much less can it be known with no faith or inferior insight. Only people of great capacity and true faith are able to enter. People without faith have difficulty accepting, even when taught. Generally, if true faith arises in your heart, you should practice and study. If it does not, you should give it up for a while and regret not having the blessing of Dharma from long ago. So, wow, faith, really critical. People without faith have difficulty accepting even when taught. Well, the things we're being taught are not obvious. So it's difficult, even in front of the best teacher, even in front of Buddha himself, it's difficult for us to accept what's being taught if we don't have some faith. So, it's interesting that Dogen says if we don't have some faith, we should just stop. just stop for a while. Until you arouse some Bodhi mind or until you arouse some faith, just don't do it yet. We'll have a hard time trying to practice if we're skeptical about awakening or the three treasures or the nature of self or any of those things, which stands to reason, right? I mean, if we don't have faith in what we're doing, it's very difficult to stay on the path, very difficult to keep going. So Uchiyama Roshi defines faith as the process of clarifying and becoming lucid about the structure and workings of the life force. Now that's a really interesting definition of faith, right? It's an interesting contrast to definitions that we might expect to find within a spiritual tradition. Something more like we need belief in a God, or we need belief in religious doctrine or something like that. He says if we get clear about how the universe and reality really work, then that itself is faith or belief. Because why? Well, we let go of our clinging to the stories we create and our ideas and the things that sort of become reality for us that we've manufactured somehow. So we shift from our reliance on faith in our delusion or faith in our perceptions or ideas to reliance on how Buddhas and ancestors see reality. Even if we can't yet quite see it for ourselves, we shift to having some faith that what they saw, really is the nature of reality and that we can see that too. That's a pretty big shift, right? I mean, that's pretty transformational. So, why would we not believe in our notions of the world that we've been developing and creating and acting on and carrying around for pretty much our whole lives? I mean, why would we throw that over? There's to be a pretty good reason, a pretty good demonstration, that we should sort of let go of that stuff. Of course, we assume that as good, smart people, we can base our decisions on what we think and on our intellect and on our own experience. So it takes some real courage to look carefully at those assumptions and to verify whether they're true or not, right? To hold them up against what Buddha is teaching and say, well, is this true or not? That really takes some fortitude. So Uchiyama Roshi says, having faith means believing that things seen through one's own eyes are not real, but things seen by Buddha's eyes are real. However, if you think that believing this is also nothing but a kind of thought, you overturn the idea. This is doubting. But the idea is overturned yet again when you let go of the doubt, because such a doubt itself is nothing other than a thought. It's an interesting world. You can let go of such doubts too. This is determined faith. No matter what kind of thought it is, it will fall away when we let go. This is where the whole world of Zazen opens. So now we get to the relationship between faith and Zazen, right? Our thoughts about the world are just our thoughts. Our ideas about faith or belief are also just our thoughts. Our doubts are also just our thoughts, and we can let go of that whole kit and caboodle when we sit down on the cushion and do Zazen, right? So it's really interesting how he's saying, well, there's faith and there's doubt and all of that stuff is, something we've conjured up, and let's sit down on the cushion and just drop the whole thing, let go of the whole thing. So he also says, it can be said that in Zazen, we believe and sit. He has this in quotes, believe and sit. But then we have to look at the meaning of believe in its Buddhist sense. Ordinarily, we use the word believe to mean thinking what someone has said is true. In religion, when an agent of a god, or God, capital G, has said that there exists an invisible metaphysical realm, God has such powers, that man has a soul, people have assumed it to be true and have acted accordingly. This has been called belief or faith. However, in Buddhism, the fundamental definition of belief is totally different. It is clarity and purity. In Buddhism, belief does not mean to believe something in one's mind, such as that every person has an individual soul or that God exists outside of us. Belief in Buddhism is to become clear and pure in actualizing the reality of universal life. In Zazen, we let go of thoughts, lower our level of excitement, and live in the universal self and live the universal self just truly being self. This is the basic meaning of belief. To the very act of doing Zazen is an expression of our belief. So there's an interesting connection, right? A couple of ways to look at this relationship between faith and Zazen. One is that we have faith that when we sit down and drop off body and mind, awakening is already there. Zazen is a complete manifestation of that awakening. Another is that we have faith that Zazen brings wholesomeness to the world beyond ourselves as individuals. So this goes beyond, I'm sitting Zazen to get something for me. I'm sitting Zazen in order to manifest my own personal brilliance or illumination or something, right? There's some faith that sitting Zazen has some larger impact, right? It can be frustrating when we're looking around at all the suffering in the world, right? And all the things that seem to be going off the rails and wondering what to do about this. And what we hear from our ancestors is one of the best things we can do is sit Zazen. And we just go, how can that help? The world is on fire, how can sitting in my house, in my corner, facing the wall, how can that help? If we were praying for intercession, maybe that would be something, at least that feels like an action. At least it feels like we're doing something with some larger connection, right? So it's tough to believe that Zazen is itself a form of beneficial action. It's not immediately obvious. But Uchiyama Roshi says, at the time, one person's Zazen influences other people and causes a chain reaction. Their Zazen is transmitted to more people, and finally it will circulate to the entire society. Under these circumstances, for the first time, we can say that human beings will open the first page of a history that is truly humane. I have been practicing Zazen with such a deep vow and faith like a prayer. So this points even to his own sort of personal practice vow, right? It's another example of our need for some humility in this practice. We don't know it all yet. Hojo-san calls practitioners baby bodhisattvas. He sometimes says, we're all baby bodhisattvas. We don't understand everything yet. We don't see everything yet. So until we can figure out how to experience the world in ways other than through relying on our stories and our opinions, and what we do with the information that comes in through the sense gates, we can have a little bit of trust. We can have some faith. So, we've talked about it here many times. Information comes in through those sense gates. We immediately decide that we like it or not, it's pleasant or not, or good or not for us. Then we start chasing and avoiding, and we base our whole lives on this chasing and avoiding. So we need to rely on the three treasures in order not to get led astray by unwholesome influences and, blindly to follow the words of others, as this gate statement says. So when I teach introductory classes on Zazen, whether that's, something within Sanshin for beginners teaching Zazen, or out in the community, teaching through the community college, there's a point where the content starts to shift. And maybe this doesn't happen so much in a short kind of introduction, but certainly in the longer classes I teach in the community, there's a point where the content starts to shift. And it shifts from things that are relatively easy to take in intellectually, to things that are really new. So Four Noble Truths seems pretty straightforward. Zazen posture, that's pretty concrete. We can kind of work with that. Buddha's life story, no problem. People can take that in. Then we get to no self and emptiness and dependent origination, right? And I watch people start to get puzzled. And they're like, what is happening here? This doesn't make sense. So in fact, I warn people the shift is coming, mostly so they don't get discouraged. I say, okay, up to now, this has all been, pretty easy to take. Okay, now we're entering, kind of a different realm. So if this doesn't make intellectual sense to you, don't worry. Take it in, let it percolate, don't worry. Because it would be so easy at that point for people to say, done. I've gotten everything out of this that I can. I don't want to go into this wacky, esoteric stuff. So, you kind of have to, even in the beginning, help people have a little faith, which when I'm saying to people, don't worry if you don't get this in your brain, let it percolate. What I'm really saying to them is have faith, have faith that this thing is connected, and all of this will make sense. So forms and small self and the relative aspect of reality sometimes seem easier to accept and easier to deal with. And then, the emptiness, universal self, absolute pieces can seem more difficult to accept and to work with. So, we can't see them or measure them or describe them. As soon as we say, well, here's this thing called emptiness, but golly, we can't put any words around it. We can't really describe it, because as soon as we do, we've missed the mark. It's like, how do we deal with that? So it might even be tough to accept that there are two sides to this one reality, because, we have the concrete reality we deal with every day. And yet here's a major theme of the Mahayana, that there's two sides to one reality, as Hojo-san says, seeing reality from two sides and expressing two sides in one action. So, what do we do with that? So Hojo-san says, because it is difficult to fathom and grasp both sides of reality at once, using concepts and intellect, as the Lotus Sutra says, we need the power of faith. Through our practice based on faith, we can experience the true reality, even though we cannot see and measure it as an object. And boy, do we want a yardstick, right? We really want to know, if I can measure this, it must be true, it must be real. And if I can't measure it, that becomes more difficult. So now we need to talk about the potential pitfalls of faith, because like everything else in practice, faith can be medicine and faith can also be poison. So two sides. So Vasubandhu back in the 5th century recognized that faith can go off the rails. He wrote a famous commentary on the Abhidharma, which is a kind of a detailed academic presentation of some things that Buddha taught in the sutras. So he points out that faith is not necessarily pure and uncontaminated in its nature. Just having faith doesn't mean it doesn't mean that can't go off the rails a bit. So he says faith applied in the wrong way toward an unskillful object or an unwholesome object can lead us to some kind of blind sort of worship, right? So we can have faith in something, but are we having faith in things that are wholesome? Because if not, we're setting ourselves up. We've got some trouble. Things go downhill from there because we start breaking precepts and we engage in various kind of unskillfulness, just because we're so convicted about something which is maybe not wholesome. So it's interesting that while the gate statement says the faculty of belief is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we do not blindly follow the words of others, that can all go downhill. That can all go the wrong way if we're not careful. So as the Russians say, trust but verify, right? So yes, we need faith, and we also need to verify. And we need to say a word here, I think, about tolerance. Because if we're talking about faith, golly, we need to talk about tolerance. So Buddhism is not a mainstream tradition. Here in the US, we frequently encounter people whose faith is different than ours. Their faith and their practice and their spiritual tradition is different than ours. We might believe so much in our practice that we think everybody ought to be sitting Zazen and reading Living by Vow and opening the hand of thought, If people want to know what we're doing, that's great. We can tell them. If not, we leave them alone. We respect, that they have a faith tradition, and we just kind of leave that be. So again, because we're not a mainstream tradition, we're probably more likely to be the object of somebody else's evangelism, maybe, than to be the ones carrying that out. But it does happen the other way. When I worked for the government and I kind of had been there for a little while, people started to learn about my Buddhist practice. I was careful to be appropriate, but you start talking to people and they find out that you're practicing. I learned that there was a supervisor in my department who had since left, who had also been a practitioner, and that a certain amount of pressure had been put on staff to also be practitioners. So staff meetings opened with the summary of the latest session. And, oh my goodness, it left a bad taste in people's mouths. There were people who did start to come and practice because they felt that kind of pressure, but people just, left a bad taste in their mouth. So after I'd been there a while, and people started to learn that I also was a practitioner, they were kind of wary of me because they thought, oh, here's another one. How do these people keep showing up in our department, But after a while, one of my coworkers said, I'm glad I met you and got to know you because I thought all Buddhist practitioners were like this person. And you're clearly not like that, So let's be careful out there. Yes, share your practice if people want to know about it. Please don't force it on people. Don't try to convert your coworkers, That's not what we're here to do. So, another side of tolerance is that we can feel the need to downplay the differences between our tradition and other faith traditions simply to get along. It can be tempting to water down what we're doing or, pretend that we're a little less convicted than we are, maybe, or something. And in the face of that, it can be difficult to maintain this faith or this trust or belief that we've now, kind of worked so hard to cultivate. If we're out in the world constantly having to downplay that or downplay the differences between what Buddha taught, and what other religious teachers taught, that makes it difficult for us to stick to it, right? As we've seen, there are various teachings in our tradition that say once we enter the stream, we start to practice, we become convinced that what Buddha's teaching is true, and then we can see that various other approaches, whatever they are, to dealing with suffering are not as effective. And maybe that's inside spiritual traditions and outside spiritual traditions, right? So certainly spiritual and non-spiritual practices that lead to compassion, wisdom, generosity, love, benevolence, morality, joy are great. That's wonderful that people are moving in that direction. And we can decide that, oh, well, in this world of religious traditions, all of them lead to the same place, right? Ultimately, they're all really not that much different. So, we can all get along. And yet, when we look at what Buddha taught, it was pretty radical. I mean, what he's teaching is pretty radical when we look at how we practice, and then, the influences of society and the influences of what comes in the sense gates and all that stuff. I mean, what he was doing was pretty different. And it's probably helpful to sort of bear that in mind, right? So the key here is that there is a difference between tolerance and endorsement, right? We can completely respect the faith and belief of others without watering down our own faith and convictions about Zazen and work and study. So without being dismissive of the real differences in various, faith traditions and various beliefs between religions and the people we encounter. We don't need to water down those differences in order to get along. I can tolerate and respect your beliefs if they're different from mine without having to make mine be the same as yours. I mean, do you see the difference, right? In a strange way, it's a sort of a form of intolerance to say, well, I can tolerate your religion as long as I dilute the differences and the particular elements that are unique to your tradition and perhaps central to your practice. If I kind of minimize all that stuff, then I can tolerate you. That doesn't sound good, right? So yes, there is common ground. There is absolutely common ground. And also, there are things that are different. And it's okay that they're there. Our tradition says, well, they're okay that they're there. So tolerance as a middle way is not about making everybody's practice the same. It's not about making everybody's faith the same or everybody's beliefs the same. Tolerance is about recognizing that people are different. They have different needs, they have different experiences, different personalities. One approach to the spiritual life doesn't work for everybody, and this should sound pretty familiar, right? This is basic skillful means. This is the same thing we encounter in teachings, where, stories where we hear, well, Buddha taught differently to different people in different circumstances because their needs were different. So we may be firmly convinced that Buddha's Dharma is, the one complete teaching about reality and how we liberate ourselves and others from suffering, but that doesn't necessarily work for everybody. And there are real differences in religious beliefs, and they may be profound and they may not really be reconcilable. What others are trying to achieve is not necessarily liberation from suffering as we understand it, which is okay. Because as bodhisattvas, we try to cultivate goodwill for everybody and respect for everybody. We don't try to, we don't resent them. We don't hinder them in their practice. We don't need to change their minds in some kind of forceful way, right? We might not agree with the belief structure of somebody else's practice, but we can certainly respect movement toward peace and harmony. So, tolerance and endorsement, not the same thing. So we may think our practice is the one true way. I have certainly seen in beginning practitioners, and I can say because I was one of them, we become infatuated with this thing. We want to live it 24/7, and we think everybody else should be living the same way, and we can't say enough about our practice. And amen. I mean, that's terrific that we, really dive into practice, but we have to be careful with that too, right? As bodhisattvas, yes, we'd like to save everybody from suffering, and at the same time, what about skillful means? Is it really skillful means to be a little bit too too out there with our practice? So, can we tolerate and respect the faith and conviction of others without necessarily endorsing those beliefs, or feeling the need to paper over the differences or to dilute the teachings of our own practice? That's something we can noodle on and think about. So, what would you like to say about the faculty of belief, or anything that's come up today, or what's percolating for you in your practice? And don't forget to unmute yourself so we can hear you when you leap in. Hoshin, you're unmuted. Are you ready to offer something?
I'll leap in here. Some years ago, we had a kind of a boiling point where the Sangha needed to talk about faith and belief, and I ended up giving a little talk on it. It didn't feel very productive, though. But what's occurring to me as you're talking about this, and I'm going to try and formulate this thought as we go. To start with, this is the first time I started to hear about the faculties that we're doing. Okay, so the faculty of belief, or the faculty of belief and faith, and we're kind of joining those two things together. I look at faculty as a kind of tool. So, I'm a tool guy, so I have this tool of belief and faculty. The belief for me is in emptiness. So how do you make the tool of emptiness a real tool in our practice? So that's kind of a question towards you, but it's, I'm also thinking of belief as a kind of conveyance. So that, in a way, makes it a tool. It's our conveyance from moment to moment, that from emptiness we acquire a kind of rational wisdom, even though we aren't calling it all that. But within that emptiness, we open up to the wisdom of the world and the wisdom of things. So there, I put it out.
Good. So faculty, yeah, what an interesting word. I think we have to be careful because, in the early teachings, again, this was pretty linear. So you develop something in order to get to something, in order to get to something, in order to get to something. And yet, probably from our perspective here, we would say, well, these things arise together. So when we're talking about the faculty of belief, again, it's one of 5 faculties which are supposed to move us towards truly seeing Dharma, truly understanding the Dharma and liberating ourselves. So it is supposed to be a movement towards something. It is a tool for something, which is supposed to be, it's a tool for helping us, see the true Dharma and liberating ourselves from suffering. And I think we can also consider, how is that not actually linear? How do these 5 elements, because now we're going to, in succeeding weeks, we're going to talk about the other 4. How do these things actually arise together? And maybe we look at it more as a support for the continuous arising of bodhicitta, rather than there's nothing and then we do these things and then something is there. Right? It's like these things are working together dynamically. So yeah, faculty is an interesting word. It's a tool for something, and yet our practice is not really linear. And it's one of those shifts that happens over the course of time and space, I think. So I'm glad you pointed that out. Actually, I should have spent some time talking about that. Maybe I will next time. Faculty as a word is really interesting. Yeah. What would others like to say about what Hoshin's brought up, or other things that occurred to you?
So I have a kind of question, I guess. Sort of have a lot of thoughts about things related to this talk. But I guess sort of my most pressing question, and something that I've thought about a lot, in English, we often have this case where we have sort of a, native, if you will, like Germanic word for something, and then like the Latin import, and then they take on different meanings over time. And that's the case with belief and faith. So, faith comes from Latin and belief is a Germanic word. And initially they meant the same thing in their respective languages, but then once they got brought into English, they took on different meanings, where belief was sort of a more secular word, and then faith was specifically kind of tied to Christianity. So, and then in Japanese, where often the same thing happens with native Japanese words and Chinese imports. For whatever reason, they must have had some way of expressing belief historically, but the only word they use now is of Chinese origin, and it encapsulates all of these things together. So you use it, in a very normal sense, like I believe you, and that's the same character that's being used in the Buddhist sense. So I guess my question here is, in modern times, I think that a lot of people don't like the word faith because it has this Christian connotation in English. So I guess my question is, first, is Buddhist faith similar enough to Christian faith that we should use that word rather than just belief or trust or something? What do you think about that?
That's really interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, so I agree with you that people often have trouble with the word faith, and so I sometimes do use trust, in something that we can't see. I don't have an immediate answer for that, but I think it's a really interesting question. Because it does force us to think about what is the nature of whatever this activity is that we're doing, having faith or believing or trusting or something. Like, what is the nature of that? I don't know. What do other people think about that? That's a really interesting question.
Hey, Doju, this is Fusatsu. That's a really interesting question. For me, I'm, again, coming from a Southern Baptist background, for me, I had to get comfortable with, what that meant for me and how can I have that conversation with other people when it comes up. So I have a particular comfort around the word faith and then to belief, but I feel like that's going to be personal for each and every one of us. But I was sitting here thinking about that too, because there are a lot of connotations that come with the word faith in general. And again, something also Hoko said kind of resonated with me about when I am in the midst of, a lot of, conversations about religion and spirituality and the watered downness, because I have had to pause in those conversations I have tried to not make it uncomfortable for people, in those conversations. So that really resonated with me. And also the other piece was Zazen as an expression of that faith. So again, Doji, that was helpful. And I am going to be that's something I'll be marinating on for the rest of the week. So I'll be interested to see what other people say as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What would others like to chip in with this? Brian's got his hand up.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, great question and talk. Thank you, Hoko. As far as the faith and belief, it strikes me that this is, it reminds me of what, I think it was Uchiyama Roshi, someone in your talk, you said, this too is actually a thought, right? So, we can argue all day, like, do you believe that the water is hot, or do you have faith in the fact that the water is hot? But if you pour the water on your hand, you're gonna say, ouch. So it's interesting how things just keep spinning back onto themselves in this kind of space, I think.
Right. Well, on the one hand, the words are just the words and the ideas are just the ideas. And on the other hand, I think Doju's raising something which is deeper, when we're considering what actually is the nature of whatever this activity is that we're being asked by this gate to engage in. So I'm not discounting what you're saying, Brian, because that's true. And also, I think he's raised a really interesting kind of nuanced thing. Did I see another hand up? Edo, please.
Well, I have always felt comfortable with the word faith. In fact, I really love it because it feels to me very like it expresses something true. I've also favored it over belief, because belief often meant to me and some others belief in something that sort of can't be believed, I'm careful in the use of that because people don't like those words. They either don't like them or they misunderstand them. And so even I have a Dharma friend, and I was going through a crisis, and I said something about, I feel like I'm losing my faith, which is an odd thing for a Buddhist to say. And he said, faith in what? And I said, well, faith in this practice, basically, which was like trust in this practice. But even to him, the word faith was like, like he couldn't resonate with that word at all. And particularly, I'm thinking of people close to me who were maybe raised as Christians and they're not Buddhist practitioners, maybe even family, but they have these strong feelings about these words. And if I use these words, they're immediately have aversion to anything I say afterwards. And so I have often used just the word trust, because it tends to connect with people a little bit, so that they're not don't have all kinds of ideas about what it means. I mean, they feel like they understand trust. It's not about believing something that can't be believed. So even my sons, who were raised Christian, because I was, have said to me, well, I never believed any of that stuff, that far-fetched weird stuff. And, for me, sometimes I felt like I missed the boat, because even personally as a Christian, faith was never about believing something that couldn't be believed. It was actually, even as a Christian, it was more about trust. Also trust in not knowing all the answers, or trust that things that in this tradition are pointing to something more than the literal thing they're saying. That kind of thing. That there was something much more there than just belief in things that cannot be believed. But a lot of people never saw any of that, including people close to me. So I'm just saying it's tricky.
Yeah. Well, so given your experience in the convent, what's your feeling about Doju's question about, can we actually use a word like faith to describe what we're doing, or is belief a better term?
I personally don't like the word belief. So I have a bias there. So and I think we can use the word faith, but I think sometimes we have to explain ourselves about kind of what we mean, depending on who we're talking to. And I think actually a lot of people, even outside of this tradition, do understand faith is like a trust in a way. I think sometimes people can understand it, but I think one just needs to be careful about their audience, who they're speaking to.
Okay. Who else would like to jump in? Mark has his hand up, and then I think I saw some others, but Mark, let's go to you.
Yeah, and so this is kind of interesting for me. I grew up in a very conservative Christian household, and my brother is a Nazarene minister, and my parents are deeply religious, and but so this is not a subject that I really talked to my parents about, except for somehow maybe she found like the Sanchin website or something like that. My mom calls me one day and it's like, "You're not worshiping Buddha now, are you?" And I was like, "Oh, no, it's nothing like that." And then I just kind of changed the subject in a way that's like, this is not right. We're not at a place to have this conversation, right? Like it's clear like a particular conception of faith or belief that applies to my mom's faith is very much different from the one that I have. So whether we're using words like faith or belief is so much constrained by context that both of them, I have no problem with either of those words actually. But then I also think about it because I have a lot of friends who are in the scientific community, who are atheists and stuff like that. And so then if, I were to use a word like faith or belief in a particular circumstance, to them, it might reflect much more of like my mom's conception of what faith or belief is. And those are the circumstances where I find myself also, there's some almost that sense to water down, what it is that you're actually practicing in order to be able to, there's no need in order to be able to do that. Like, I think that you mentioned, because I think there's sometimes this tendency to like, oh no, like Buddhism is totally scientific, don't worry about it, or anything like that, which it's not that either. So I don't necessarily know where I'm going with this, except for like, I'm kind of wrestling with the use of these words, faith and belief, which I have no problem with in my own practice, but how I would feel uncomfortable using those in expression either to my family or to my more kind of secular science-y friends. So that's all I got.
Okay, what would others like to say? Hoshin, please.
I kind of want to respond to all that's been said, and it was kind of spurred by what Faculties said originally. I can see almost a rung, several rungs of like faith, belief, certainty, and a fluidity that could happen in there. It's sort of like faith and belief working, flowing together. And then there's the certainty of having the hot water spilled on your hand, as Brian said. So we tend to want to make words actualities, which becomes a problem whenever we practice, because as soon as we have a word for something, we put a boundary around it. It needs to be this certain thing, when in reality, it's a very fluid process. And that's what I've always felt about this Buddhist practice. It's perpetually looking for the fluidity from the point of the Eightfold Path or something like that. So that's where I'm going with all this.
Okay, and Russ has his hand up.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Michael. Well, maybe not exactly right. I'm using words. It's probably partly wrong, but the Buddha. I mean that's we often talk about. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on it. But the Buddha would skillful means. Presenting the truth that others are willing to hear, or are ready to hear, rather. And I'm working with someone right now, and we're working on a really, really political issue, and things change moment by moment. And her favorite phrase is "stay in the moment," which is really funny to hear from a politician, but it's so true. I mean, and so it's like we can't make, while we don't want to make firm distinctions of, are we going to choose faith, belief, and or trust? My personal preference is trust. I'm among those who have kind of real problems because of my Catholic background with faith and trust. But it's even in the extent of staying in the moment in each conversation. I agree with Mark in terms of I wouldn't use, most of the time I wouldn't use faith or belief in scientific friends, but not always. I mean, it's I think it's a matter of staying in the moment for what we're going to use. So I really resonate with what you're saying about just being dynamic and aware of every moment on this. I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know if that's a question.
That's all right. Reflections are welcome too. Sawyer's got his hand up over there. I don't want to miss him.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it might be helpful to bring the word doubt in. And I was practicing with a teacher. Fusatsu knows him. It's good to see you here, Fusatsu, by the way. Zenku Sensei, who I was practicing with in Montana, really helped me by instructing me not to harbor doubt. So not to be without doubt, being without doubt, or somehow beyond doubt, as a kind of mirror word for belief or faith. And belief and faith both feel to me like you have belief in something, or faith in something, or trust of something, whereas just being without doubt has a sort of like opening feeling to me.
So it feels a little bit more like letting go of a hindrance as opposed to trying to cultivate a virtue.
Right.
Yeah, which is different, right? There's a different feeling for that. And we know, because we've talked about doubt before, in this tradition, doubt is a hindrance. So it's interesting to put those two things together like you just did and see, what's in that intersection. What would others like to say? This Mark, Myogen, and then Ado, I see you.
Sawyer's question, or Sawyer's comments actually make me laugh, because my question was, is there room for doubt in our practice? And I don't really, and as I'm sitting with it, I don't really see it as a question, because, if it's if we look at it as a typical question, it's just a word, it's something that you discriminate on. But then also our practice is built upon vow and repentance. It's built upon samsara and delusion are one. And so in a sense, doubt is faith. So it's, yeah, this is getting kind of interesting. So.
So we've got two sides of one reality, right? We have no separation. That's an interesting thing to sit with too. And I don't want to forget Ado, because she's tried twice to get my attention now, and I keep ignoring her. Unmute yourself so we can hear you. There we go.
This is kind of off the track now, because, but when we were talking about using these words, and I said, well, it depends on the audience and what the circumstances are, and what is the purpose of the conversation we're having. I mean, so for instance, if we're being challenged by somebody, well, I'm thinking some examples of a Christian friend of mine years ago. We were talking outside my car, and she saw inside my car that I had a book about Buddhism, and she had a similar reaction. To somebody else said, "Oh my God, are you worshiping Buddha?" And I said, "No," but I didn't. Here's the thing. I didn't need to be understood by her. I realized this, and I wasn't going to be, so I wasn't going to give a lot of explanations. And then she said, "Well, you know, there's only one true way." And I said, "Yes, I do know that." And that was the end of the conversation. And it was very genuine on my part. But she didn't understand. She probably felt reassured. She probably thought I was trying to tell her that I was a Christian. In a way, it didn't matter to me what she thought, as long as my response was, for me, it was a genuine response. And I didn't need to be understood, and I certainly was not understood.
Oh, it's interesting what happens, isn't it, when we try to have these conversations with folks. Did I see a hand up? I don't want to ignore anybody. Doju, please come back in and tell us now how we've wrestled with your question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer to it either. I mean, I think that Russ's point about skillful means is probably important here, because depending on who you're talking to, it might be better to use belief or faith. But I do have like one comment on the Indic, so like the Sanskrit origin of the word. So the word that's most often, I guess, translated as faith or belief is shraddha, which is like actually more like a faculty, as in the case of this. So like your sort of capacity for trust. Because when it's negated, the opposite is not doubt or something like that. It's sort of a lack of the capacity to trust someone, which I think is interesting. So it's a little bit different, and it's kind of antonym compared to the English sense. But the other thing that I was going to ask you is that because Buddhism in modern times has tried to sort of present itself as being kind of compatible with science, as Mark mentioned. I think that has led to something of a de-emphasis of faith. Whereas, if you look at Japanese Buddhism, especially in like Pure Land Buddhism, faith is extremely important. It's like all there is. And I think in that context, like in the Pure Land school, faith is actually pretty similar in some ways to Christian faith. And it's actually sort of equated with awakening, almost like when you're in a state of faith, you're already sort of dwelling in awakening in the same way that we think when we do Zazen. We're kind of there with awakening. So my question then to you, Hoko, is should we continue that tact of sort of de-emphasizing faith so we can appeal to modernists who like science, or should we sort of go back to the old way of emphasizing faith? What do you think about that?
Well, I suppose if we decide that we want to attract as many people as possible, then we choose our words with that particular way. And, I spent several decades in public information. So, you know, appealing to an audience, I get that. I'm of two minds about that. I kind of think faith has to happen before we can practice. In some ways, even I would say, even, you know, those folks that practice what we call secular Buddhism, there has to be some faith there in something, or they wouldn't do it, right? I mean, you know, even if we're going to decide we're not going to be sort of devotional, you know, we're going to kind of take this, you know, in a secular direction, I think there's still some faith there, because we don't start any project unless we have some faith that it's wholesome and, you know, meaningful and effective and all of that. So, you know, maybe we don't talk about faith. Maybe, you know, maybe the folks who practice in that style don't talk about faith, you know, maybe talk more about belief. I don't know. I'm kind of the opinion that it's good to talk about faith and then let people do with that what they're going to do with it. Because I think somehow, sometimes, especially in the West, when we encounter Buddhism and what we hear is, oh, this is great. This is a spiritual practice where we don't have to believe in things. There's no God. Our own experience is our yardstick. You know, we kind of can do what we want. It's a spiritual technology. It's really logical and scientific and therefore very contemporary. In some ways, it closes the door to faith. In some ways, it says we're not allowed to approach this in terms of faith. You know, and maybe that's not a word everybody likes. Maybe trust is better. Maybe belief is good. But, you know, somehow I would like that door to stay open for people that want to practice with that. And it might be that we're not ready to practice with it, or, you know, we come to want to practice with that later on, or, I mean, I don't know. But it's like, I kind of don't want to close the door to that, because there is real influence, I think, in the West to approach this thing from a very logical, scientific, you know, Buddha was a scientist kind of approach. And then what happens to the parts of our hearts and minds that want to have a faith tradition? It's like, you know, are we allowed to do that? Or is there a place in the tradition for that? Now, today with us, we have Cohn Levy, because she and Hoshin are coming from Florida, from her zendo in Florida. When she was a Shuso at Sanshin, one of her talks was about faith. And she started out by saying, we don't talk about faith very much in this tradition, you know, and in some ways she's not wrong. So it's like, is there, especially for those who are coming from another faith tradition, or even those who aren't, it's like, is there a place in our practice for faith? And if we feel that arising, is like, how do we practice with that, right? So I think one of the, as I've said before, one of the good things about going through these 108 gates is that I am forced to talk about things I would not normally talk about, because I don't have a choice. I just take the next, you know, gate, and then I am forced to investigate that and say, what does that mean for us in our modern practice? And then where do those things come from? You know, so left to our own devices, we might never talk about faith. And yet here we are. We've had a really interesting, you know, hour and a half talking about faith. So should we continue, you know, making it a part of our practice? I would say yes, because we don't want to close the door on any aspect of human experience. Now, do we have to practice carefully with it? Sure. You know, and if we don't like the word faith, are there other ways that we can deal with it? Yeah, of course. You know, let's use faith, you know, let's use trust or belief or whatever. But I would not want to drop it entirely. I mean, that's my personal feeling. It's like I've even, you know, so last time we talked about 4 bases of mystical power. And in a way, we can kind of say, well, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, do we want to lock out mystical power? I mean, you know, we don't talk about that here, right? If Buddha was a scientist, you know, then our practice is not about logic, not about magic, you know, and not about mystical powers and people sending their bowls flying through the air and all that stuff. And yet, you know, one unified reality. Is there any part of this thing that's not part of Buddha's way? So is faith part of Buddha's way? Sure. And is doubt part of Buddha's way? Sure. And, you know, it's like, maybe we don't want to ignore, you know, any part of this one unified reality. But just like everything else, there are skillful means and multiple ways to practice with that, you know, and given karmic circumstances, we do have to be skillful with it. So you know, you raised just really interesting questions. And of course, there's no one easy, quick answer. That's what arises for me. For others, they may have some other something else to say. Other things people would like to say this morning? Faith, belief, trust, faculty. Cohen's got her hand up.
Yeah, well, you brought me
I pointed at you.
the picture here, and when I did speak of that, giving that talk, Hojo-san specifically said in Japanese, faith and trust are almost synonymous. However, in listening to everyone here, part of me said, by dissecting this, we lose it. By putting all these pieces together, the whole is greater than anything we can say. And, you know, don't tell me, show me. Express all of this as we do in our practice. And that eclipses every little piece. It's like you cook. I know you cook. When you take the cake out, it's everything there. You can't just dissect it. So I think our challenge here is wanting to go and see the individual components when it's really everything coming together in our practice as an expression of all of this.
So we get to hold both, right? You know, it's fine to look at the pieces, and then we also have to look at the one unified reality. So yes, we get to hold both of those things. So you see, if you think your Shuso time had no effect on anybody, I still remember your talk.
Also, I was going to say with most faith traditions.
I didn't hear you.
I said with most faith traditions, regardless, I mean, as long as we're not sacrificing people on the altar in any faith tradition, that once you are quiet and just participate, there's a better understanding than when you start to chit chat back and forth. It somehow, especially with people that aren't practitioners, I find it can sometimes separate you rather than just come together and just to sit down quietly for a few minutes and just be. I don't think, as you would in a church or in a mosque or in a temple or in a zendo, it seems like the underlying, whatever you care to call it, there's more similarity than not. But the words somehow can divide us.
Other things folks would like to say this morning? Any last comments, reflections? Doju.
Yeah, so just kind of one last thing from me. The reason that, you know, I'm so interested in this question is because, you know, I grew up in like basically a totally secular household. So for me, faith meant belief without evidence, you know, in sort of a kind of negative sense. Mm-hmm. And when I started practicing Buddhism, you know, I think you know, my view on that evolved quite a bit because Zazen is quite mysterious. You know, I think that, you know, I don't really enjoy doing it. I wouldn't say, like, it's not like a fun thing. Exactly. You know, it's painful and, you know, but I would never stop doing it because of this kind of strange power that it has. And for me, that's kind of what faith gets at, that maybe belief can't as well. But it's hard to share something like that with other people, with that, like you were just saying, Cohen, without actually doing it and sitting down and being quiet yourself. And I also just wanted to say that you know, one thing that Hojo-san said at one point that was helpful for me in understanding faith was this idea of like digging in the sand, where you're digging down to find water, and at a certain point the sand becomes moist. And at that point, you know, like I should keep going, you know, and I'll get to water eventually. So there is like some evidence there. Like I think when we do Zazen, we feel something. So it's not accurate to say that it's belief without evidence, because there is some amount of evidence, but it's sort of a subtle evidence, I think. So at any rate, I'll shut up now.
Oh, that's good. No, that's good. You always have useful things to contribute. I had forgotten that picture of the sand and the water. That's really helpful. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that he says. So thank you for bringing that back to us. Other comments this morning, reflections, questions? Have we had enough for today? All right. Thanks for a very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
And thanks for your practice. And back to Hoshin now for our closing chants.